Before we get started, I just want to take a minute to introduce the Interagency Arctic Research Policy Committee, where I am the web manager and communications officer. And we're bringing you this webinar today through IARPC Collaborations, which is our platform for bringing together the broader Arctic research community of researchers and stakeholders. And through IARPC Collaborations, we're able to team up and tackle the big problems in Arctic research. So right now I'm showing you our website where we have over 1,500 people sharing resources and connections. If everybody could please go to mute, or Meredith, if you could help me mute people, that would be great.
Jessica, you're going to have to make me a co-host if you want me to do that.
Okay, thanks. So let me just quickly finish this. So we have 9 thematic collaboration teams that are led by federal program managers and non-federal partners. And these collaboration teams meet monthly, and they're open to anyone who can contribute. They meet to discuss and make progress in their research areas and also hold additional webinars. So if you want to join in to other webinars, I'd really like to encourage you to request an account on our website, which you see here, iarpiccollaborations.org. And the button on the top right shows go to member home for me, but if you're new to the website, it will say request an account. So as a reminder, please go to mute. If you have a question, you can put it into the chat box, which is in the bottom center of your Zoom window. We're going to hold questions to the end. And now I'd like to introduce Carolina Behe, who is our host for this webinar. She is a co-lead of the Coastal Resilience Collaboration Team and with ICC Alaska, and she's going to welcome you. So go ahead, Carolina.
Okay, thank you, Jessica. And thank you everyone for joining us today. Can everybody see my screen okay?
Yep.
Okay, great. So increasingly, people and institutions are recognizing the value of a co-production of knowledge. And while this term is being used in various ways, today we're talking about bringing together Indigenous knowledge and science. We look forward to sharing with you some of our thoughts on co-production of knowledge, a few examples, and to facilitate a discussion about bringing Indigenous knowledge and science together through equitable partnerships. Our speakers today include Rochelle Daniel, Nicole Mert, and Anthony Mahoney, and myself. So I'm going to get started first with the first presentation. I'm the Indigenous Knowledge and Science Advisor for the Inuit Circumpolar Council, located, and I work out of the Alaska office. So ICC advocates on behalf of Inuit across Chukotka, Alaska, Greenland, and Canada. This map shows you Inuit Nunat, or Inuit homeland. You see Inuit are vastly across the Arctic here, just like other Arctic Indigenous peoples. And it's really important to note before we start that Inuit and Alaska Indigenous peoples are more than just stakeholders. They've called the Arctic home from time immemorial and acquired a knowledge system that has been shaped by the environment that they live in. Indigenous knowledge is a systematic way of thinking.
Different came in fourth in the women's slalom. She won.
Okay. Indigenous knowledge is a systematic way of thinking applied to phenomenon across biological, physical, cultural, and spiritual systems. It includes insights based on evidence acquired through direct and long-term experiences, and extensive and multi-generational observations, lessons, and skills. It has developed over millennia and is still developing in a living process, including knowledge acquired today and in the future, and is passed on from generation to generation. So 3 key points that we would like you to keep in mind during this presentation and leaving this presentation is that Indigenous knowledge is a systematic way of knowing. It is a developing living process that continues to be built upon and grow, and that it holds its own methodologies, evaluation, and validation processes. So what we share with you today comes directly from Alaska Inuit when we talk about food security. And it comes from the work that we did with Alaska Inuit from these 4 regions to develop the work that we're going to share. So Inuit possess a unique understanding of food security within the Arctic, an understanding that goes far beyond nutrients and calories, to understand that there's an encompassing of both cultural and ecological systems, systems which interlink and support each other. This is the Inuit ecosystem. It is made up of many parts. So please notice here that there's not meant to be any hierarchy. Everything is needed and is important. That means that everything from the feast that you see up on the screen to the right, to the zooplankton, to the lichen, to the whale, are all equally important here. So as we were going through this project, one way that an elder described the Arctic was as a puzzle, saying that all these pieces are fitting together. And it's required to know how all these pieces fit together and to see all these pieces to understand what's happening. So as scientists, you can understand, you can think of these puzzle pieces as systems. These are interlinking systems. And a challenge comes when we just look at one piece of that puzzle. So if we look at just that beluga in the middle, without realizing how that puzzle is connected to all the other pieces around it. IK tells us that the greatest points of vulnerability lie where these systems interconnect. If the systems begin to separate, to not connect, there's a large problem. And maybe that is what we're referring to when we talk about tipping points. Some of you may recognize this as an ecosystem perspective. However, this concept goes beyond that and begins to explain how we are seeing the environment. Humans are part of the ecosystem here. And under IK, the two can't be separated. So through this, when we talk about food security and how is this related to Indigenous knowledge, through this project, the Indigenous knowledge holders developed this drum, and it's a conceptual framework that gives you all the pieces needed to understand and to look at food security. So you'll see in the center here that we have food security, and it's characterized by environmental health. Surrounding that are the pieces that are needed to make up a healthy environment. And that includes availability, culture, decision-making power and management, health and wellness, stability and accessibility. Surrounding that are the tools that we need. We need both Indigenous knowledge and science. We need policy. We need co-management. And holding it all up is food sovereignty. Now the words along the outside are like sinew, holding it all together, and that's the spirit of all. This is bringing all of the pieces of an ecosystem together to look at it holistically. So what does it mean to apply a food security lens? What is it meant by holistic? But this gives us an example. This is kind of a concept map where you see walrus in the center here. And we can tell a story to kind of go through this. That when we have a question about walrus, we also have to ask about sea ice thickness. And we have to ask about benthic species. We have to ask about the content of the walrus stomach. We have to ask about currents and salinity levels, about changes in wind direction, but we also have to consider the young boy that's being taken out every year to learn his relationship within this environment and with the walrus. And then 1 year gets his first catch and brings that back to provide to an elder. And at that point, that boy has become a provider as opposed to being provided for. This is self-identity. That self-identity and human health can't be separated from the walrus health or the sea ice thickness or all of those other pieces. So to kind of recap on parts of these pieces, I hope that gives you a brief idea of Indigenous knowledge and what it is bringing to the table here. So it's important, this allows this Indigenous knowledge, this food security lens allows for us to see the entire picture, to see the entire puzzle. And again, that you can't disconnect them to understand the entirety of what is going on. So before we go to the next presentations and just recap, we want to think about that these systems are comprised of connections among health of people, animals, and plants, different states of land, sea, and air, cultural fabric held together by language, culture, expression, and social integrity. Within the Inuit system, it is impossible to disentangle from these relationships. So today we have a holistic understanding. We need both Indigenous knowledge and science, a co-production of knowledge. To get there, we have to have trust and respect, equitable partnerships, understand that IT and science are two different knowledge systems, and that is a good thing. We're often asking different questions, and both questions are needed to see the entire puzzle. So that concludes my presentation, Koyana, and I'm just going to go over to Rochelle Daniel, who will provide her next presentation. And Rochelle grew up in the Yupik village of Tuntatuliak, Alaska. She currently is with the Pew Charitable Trust, the U.S. Arctic Program. She works on natural resource policy issues with a focus on marine ecosystems, bridging Indigenous knowledge and science in decision-making and advancing the co-production of knowledge. So with that, Rochelle? Rochelle, you might be on mute.
Okay, there, I unmuted myself. Thank you, Carolina. And again, just a couple of key points about my background so you can understand my perspective and where I'm coming from. As Carolina mentioned, I grew up in Tuntatuliak, Alaska, at the mouth of the Kuskokwim and Bering Sea. And I grew up in a Yupik community in a different worldview. And then I attended university, undergraduate school, and studied marine mammal biology. And there I gained an appreciation and understanding of the scientific method. And so I carry with me these experiences firsthand of knowing different knowledge systems and the importance of both knowledge systems. And the two knowledge systems that I will be focusing on in this talk today are science and Inuit Indigenous knowledge. And Carolina mentioned the importance of an interconnected understanding of ecosystems from an Inuit worldview. And I just wanted to ensure that I repointed this out to everybody here today. A co-production of knowledge brings together knowledge systems to create both new knowledge and a better understanding of the environment around us. And this is a concept that is increasingly recognized by the scientific community at large. However, in many instances, it's often incorrectly applied. And so we differentiate a co-production of knowledge approach from a multidisciplinary research approach, where a multidisciplinary research approach brings together different disciplines from the scientific field, such as biology or chemistry or the social sciences. And in the case of social sciences, oftentimes they're synthesizing Indigenous knowledge without the direct participation of the expert knowledge holders. And so today, I'd like to focus on a couple of key elements for a co-production of knowledge approach. And I'm looking forward to the discussion at the end, so I'll keep this fairly brief. Equity is a cornerstone for a co-production of knowledge approach. And here, equity refers to fairness. In this context, it's ensuring that both Indigenous knowledge and science start from a level playing field. So a co-production of knowledge framework underscores the role and value of each knowledge system and the different methodologies contained therein within each of getting information and an understanding. So Indigenous knowledge should be respected and valued as its own knowledge system. And we encourage moving away from viewing Indigenous knowledge purely to support science and moving away from using science to validate Indigenous knowledge. So science is quite specific when referenced. Similarly, Indigenous knowledge holds its own methodologies and evaluation system, as Carolina was referencing in her talk. And so experts from both knowledge systems should work together collaboratively in determining which information is gathered, what questions are asked, what methodologies are used, and how analysis is conducted. And so in applying Indigenous knowledge plus science in creating new knowledge and understanding, you'll need experts from both knowledge systems from the very beginning of a project. And that means substantial leadership from Indigenous knowledge holders. Equally important are culturally appropriate methodologies to gather knowledge and analyze information collected. And that should be agreed upon equally by both knowledge system experts. Therefore, it'll be important to use plain language in reaching a common understanding. And quite often, a participatory approach with both subject matter experts could be applied. It's also important to recognize the sovereign rights of Indigenous peoples over their own knowledge. In particular, the principles of free, prior, and informed consent are critical to this process. And so more specifically, this includes Indigenous peoples fully understanding both the risks and the benefits of participating in a research project. And Indigenous knowledge holders and Indigenous communities should also have authority in determining how data and information from a project are shared and distributed. As we all understand that there are some data that are considered proprietary, and these data are shared accordingly depending on the data holder. For example, whether it's a state agency or industry or a contracting company. And then consent also includes the right for a community not to participate in the project. And so this means saying no once understanding, the full range of risks and opportunities. And I'd like to point out that it's really important that equity is met throughout the research process. So capacity building is another important component of a co-production of knowledge approach, and it can help build equity. And capacity building is needed for both Indigenous communities and the scientific community. So in the case of Indigenous communities and Indigenous knowledge holders, this would be the need to actively participate in research throughout all phases as co-investigators and participants from the beginning of a project to the end of a project. And so therefore communities need support to use, prepare, distribute, and implement the results from our project. So imagine in a pre-proposal development process, as a researcher, it's very common to include time and salary for the PI and other research assistants. Similarly, this is needed for Indigenous knowledge co-investigators and other community members that are assisting collecting research, analyzing research, and sharing research. So capacity building for researchers is equally important and may include such items as training and education about philosophies, cosmologies, and Indigenous knowledge and methodologies. Furthermore, there's also a need to identify opportunities where the two knowledge experts can come together and start the creative process of identifying research needs and opportunities. So one of the most important factors for building long-term success and achieving co-production of knowledge approach is fostering and working towards true partnerships. So a good first step could be to understand the lay of the land in the region you're interested in working. By this, it's important to leverage networks, institutions, and organizations. So as scientists, you understand your networks. And so it's important to understand that Indigenous peoples also live in complex social and governance systems. And getting to know these is a good first step. It's also important to understand what partnerships mean from an Indigenous worldview and the differentiation from participation. So just attending a meeting, if an Indigenous knowledge holder or expert is attending a meeting, that doesn't necessarily equate to being in a partnership or a collaboration. Oftentimes, clear, transparent, and culturally appropriate terms of reference, are recommended, such that no misunderstandings occur, and it also helps with relationship building. And so, where are we going from here? In January, Carolina, myself, and our colleague Julie Raymond-Jacobian from COERIC hosted a workshop at the Alaska Marine Science Symposium that brought together researchers and community members to start talking about a draft framework. And we're currently compiling the information that we put together prior to the workshop and incorporating feedback during the workshop, and we'll be sharing that in the coming months. And as new opportunities arise, we'll be sure to share that effort with folks on Arabic. And so in conclusion, I just wanted to emphasize the importance of bringing different knowledge systems together in a co-production of knowledge approach. And that this approach is very important, especially now, with a quickly changing climate and the need for communities to adapt and help build community resilience. And so I want to thank you for attending the workshop today and look forward to the discussion.
Koyana, Rochelle. So next we'll hear from Nicole Mert. Nicole is a social scientist with the U.S. Geological Survey in Denver, Colorado. Nicole has been working with Indigenous communities in the Yukon-Kuskokwim Delta region in Western Alaska since 2009 to document change through community-based monitoring and qualitative methods. Nicole.
All right, thank you. So I'm going to talk today about a project that was a collaboration between the U.S. Geological Survey's Water Mission Area and Alaska Science Center with Yukon-Kuskokwim Delta communities, the Yukon Delta Berry Outlook. Sorry, oh, there we go, okay. So wild berries are an important resource across Alaska for both human and non-human animal communities. This is particularly true in the Yukon-Kuskokwim Delta in Western Alaska, which supports one of the largest waterfowl populations in North America, and where families which are living in some of the largest Alaska Native villages can pick upwards of 75 liters of berries annually. We know that the landscape is changing across Alaska, but we currently lack the data and tools to accurately predict how distribution and productivity of berry-producing plants will change with landscape change. So to fill in some of the gaps in our understanding of ecological drivers, we looked to the local knowledge and observations of the people that are living here and collecting this resource year after year. So the objectives of this project were first to understand whether berry resources are changing in this region, and then understand the drivers of berry habitat and abundance, or in other words, why are these changes happening? And attempt to forecast changes and develop useful tools for communities to support adaptation. So first we needed to understand if there was a shared knowledge of drivers of abundance and distribution of berries in the YK Delta. So to do this, we administered cultural consensus surveys. We also wanted to understand where people are harvesting specific type of berries and if those locations had changed in recent years, so that we could attempt to pinpoint if vegetation changes were happening in specific locations. And then finally, the goal is to combine this information with existing ecological data to create forecasts, as well as use the information gained through these surveys and mapping to guide the development of specific ecological monitoring moving forward. So just to get us all on the same page, I wanted to just spend a minute on the cultural consensus surveys themselves. A cultural consensus survey is a specific type of survey which assumes that respondents have a shared culture. The answers are provided by each respondent independently of all other respondents, and that questions are on the same topic and level of difficulty. So this type of survey is attempting to establish whether there is a shared knowledge among the respondents. So we're not necessarily trying to verify that there's a correct scientific knowledge, but instead just a consensual knowledge about a particular topic. So to do this, the survey is administered orally, and the participants are read statements that they are asked to agree or disagree with. In the case of our survey, participants were also given a third option of don't know. So an example statement from our survey is up on the slide there. If there is a small amount of snow in the winter, there will be fewer berries in the summer. And then we also asked some spatial questions to attempt to get a handle on potential local scale landscape change. We administered 53 surveys in the villages of Hooper Bay, Chivak, Kotlik, and Amonic, which are all located in the Yukon-Kuskokwim Delta region of Western Alaska. The pie chart here shows the breakdown of participants from each village. The surveys focused on 5 different species of berries: salmonberry, blackberry, blueberry, cranberry, and redberry. And we ensured that we, as the folks administering the survey, as well as our respondents, were talking about the same berry by showing pictures of each berry before beginning, and then asking if there were any other names that this berry is known by locally. For example, salmon berries could be called cloudberries in other parts of Alaska, and red berries could also go by several different names. So of the 53 participants, 34 were female and 19 were male, and these box and whisker plots here show some other demographic information. In order to participate in our project, respondents had to have lived in their village for at least 10 years and been berry picking consistently that whole time. Someone did slip through that had only been living in their community for 4 years, but on average, our respondents lived in their village for 46 years with a maximum of 84. The average age of our respondents was 55 and ranged from 30 to 84 years old. And the average number of years our respondents had been picking berries was 43 with a minimum of 10 and a maximum of 79. So there's a lot of experience in observing the environment and interacting with this resource represented by our respondents here. So the goal of the Cultural Consensus Survey, as I said, is to establish whether or not there was a shared knowledge concerning the ecological drivers of berry abundance and distribution. So to analyze the survey results to this end, we use this freely available toolbox that relies on Bayesian statistics to determine if there is a consensus among the respondents, and also allows for don't know responses. Many of the other statistical tools available to analyze this type of data only allow for dichotomous yes or no responses. This toolbox also allows you to enter explanatory covariates, which in our case were gender, age, village of residence, number of years living in the village of residence, and the number of years picking berries. So this slide is just showing a couple of screenshots from the toolbox interface. This green box here is where you input your data, and then this yellow box is the first cut of results. So if the assumptions of the cultural consensus theory are met, then you can model the culturally correct answers based on the real data. So we ran our responses for each berry through the toolbox separately. And what I'm showing here is a scree plot. This is a result of the posterior predictive model check that the toolbox does to check if there is a one culture represented by the survey data. So this black line here is showing the real data, and the gray is showing the modeled culturally correct answers. Now this is from data that does represent one culture. This is the scree plot that our data produced. So you can see that this black line that shows the real data that should drop off substantially and then gradually taper off is instead doing this sort of stepwise thing. And the culturally correct modeled data are not falling in line with our real data. So what this means is that based on the data we collected, we cannot assume that we are representing a shared cultural knowledge and cannot model the culturally correct answers. However, this does not mean that there was no agreement among the survey responses. If we instead aggregate the responses based on the individual statements contained in the survey instead of the overall drivers that we asked questions about, then we can see that there's a lot of agreement for many of these different statements. These are the results for salmon berries, which 100% of respondents said were important in their household. 75% disagreed that they have to travel further in the past than they did to collect this berry. 86% agreed that having a small amount of snow is associated with fewer berries. 88% agreed that hot summer temperatures impact how many salmon berries there will be. And 82% of respondents agreed that salmon berries are ripening earlier in the season than they did 10 years ago. So if we look at the responses for these individual statements across different berry species, we can see that the drivers that the majority of respondents agreed were important for salmon berries, temperature, rain, and snow, are also important for these other berries. The agreement does appear to be strongest for salmon berries, which is likely due to the fact that they are the most important berry in the household. Importance of each berry in household is shown over here. That its second most important berry was blackberries, which all but one respondent stated was important in their household, followed by blueberries. The level of importance drops off kind of substantially when we get to cranberries and red berries, which means our sample size for those berries drops off as well, as people only responded to statements concerning the berries that they pick actively each year. So each respondent was also asked to map the locations that they currently pick each berry species, and if that had changed, to also map where they previously picked berries. If the location had changed, we then asked some specific questions to better understand what drove changes in location. The resulting digitized maps help give us information about areas of high density harvesting, shown as these darker locations where different participants' harvesting locations are overlapping. It can also give us information about the distances folks are traveling from the village center and differences in distance traveled between villages. This particular map is showing salmon berry harvesting locations, both current and present, of all participants from all 4 villages. So if we put together the information we gathered about the most important ecological drivers and the locations where people are gathering berries, we can begin to look towards what the future might look like by using available climate projections. So this map is showing historic snow depth in millimeters, overlaid with those current and past berry harvesting locations that I just showed you. So looking into the future, we can see that snow depth is expected to decrease by 2050 and continue to decrease into 2080. And if we look at projected summer temperatures, this is the decadal mean for the summer months of June, July, and August over the years 2010 to 2019. These are now just current salmonberry locations shown as these black and gray outlines and points. And if we look to the future, we can see that temperature is projected to increase 2 to 4 degrees Celsius for the decade 2040 to 49 and continue to increase into the decade 2070 to 79. And precipitation over the summer months of June, July, and August is shown here, again with the salmonberry locations shown in black outlines and dots. And if we look to the future for precipitation, we can see that it doesn't appear to change much and may actually increase a bit. So to conclude here, we asked questions about a host of ecological drivers and indicators. And although we did not establish a consensus when looking at all of these drivers as a whole, we did establish an observational link for 3 main drivers: snowpack, summer precipitation, and summer temperature. So there are a variety of reasons that could explain why we were unable to establish a consensus that don't necessarily mean that there isn't a shared knowledge about the drivers of berry resources. We could have been asking questions about drivers that are unimportant and aren't observed in this region. And so a lack of consensus could just indicate a lack of importance for those drivers and therefore a lack of information concerning them. Looking to the future at these different climate projections, we can see that the future of berry productivity in this region may not be great, with snowpack decreasing, summer temperatures increasing, and although summer precipitation may increase, these increased summer temperatures could still result in overall drier conditions. So there's still a lot more to understand and to do. We know that saltwater intrusion harms many of these species, but we don't know a lot about storm surges in the future. In this region, the existing climatological data that I showed is really at a coarse scale, so we don't know a lot about local snow patterns and weather influences. There are other influences that we don't know a lot about, such as pollinators or changes in permafrost that may be impacting berries. And finally, we don't know a lot about variability and whether that is changing. Our surveys showed that a majority of respondents observed that salmon berries are ripening on average about a month earlier over the past 10 years. And you hear this anecdotally when you're talking with folks in these communities about berry resources. And we also know anecdotally that this past summer, 2017, there were a lot of blackberries and there were very few blackberries and a lot of blueberries. But in our surveys, there was no agreement about whether harvests are becoming more variable in the past. So I want to acknowledge the Western Alaska Landscape Conservation Cooperative for funding this project, as well as all of these other agencies that provided their support. And I will hand it back to Carolina. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Nicole. So next we're going to hear from Andy Mahoney. Dr. Andy is a research assistant professor of geophysics at the University of Alaska Fairbanks, where he leads the Geophysical Institute's Sea Ice Research Group and is known for his work with Arctic communities and efforts to utilize indigenous knowledge into polar research. Andy, I'll just check if you're on mute.
Thank you. Yes, I was getting ahead of myself. Thank you. Thank you for the introduction. And of course, I'm just one part of a large team of researchers that includes scientists at universities, indigenous experts from the native village of Kotzebue, as well as engineers and documentary filmmaker. So our project is a fairly new project. We're quite an early stage, certainly compared to the talk that Nicole just gave. We don't actually have any results yet, and so I'm going to be introducing the project and how we've been spending our first year. The most important part of our project, I think the thing that distinguishes it, is the makeup of our team. We actually have an advisory council of Indigenous experts that has been part of the team since day one of the project. And then they sort of provide the focal point for us in Kotzebue, and they bring together, or they help tie together the other scientists who come from Columbia University in New York, University of Alaska Fairbanks here in Fairbanks, Alaska, as well as documentary filmmaker from Farthest North Films, and unmanned aerial systems engineers from Tucson, Arizona. And the name of our project, I should have mentioned that at the beginning, is Iqaqlik Sikukun. I apologize for the Inupiaq speakers if I butchered the pronunciation there, but this was a name that was come up with through collaboration with our advisory expert council. And it means ice bridge. And the idea is that we're bridging the scientific and indigenous knowledge communities to understand the sea ice and everything involved with the sea ice. You can't just look at sea ice without also considering marine mammals and the ocean and the weather and the climate. And so we're bridging the two ways of knowing to further our understanding of the ice. Our study region, I'm sure many of you are familiar with Alaska and where Kotzebue is, but this just sort of shows that we'll be based in Kotzebue, but we'll be able to study the sea ice immediately on the shores of Kotzebue, out into the broader Kotzebue Sound, and then also out into the Chukchi Sea, where we've seen some of the most rapid retreats of sea ice anywhere in the world over the last few decades. And we'll be able to obtain this sort of coverage through the use of some cutting edge technology, some long range unmanned aerial systems. These are a new type of drone that's been developed. They're capable of vertical takeoff and landing, so they don't need a runway. And once they're up in the air, they can fly for up to 20 hours with carrying up to 15 pounds of scientific equipment. We're going to have 3 of these drones, and each drone is going to have different types of scientific payload that can be effectively bolted on and swapped in between, so that we can carry out multiple different types of scientific mission to understand the environment around Kotzebue. We're also going to be supporting these aerial measurements with in situ observations. We'll be measuring the growth and melt of sea ice immediately adjacent to Kotzebue through a community-based sea ice mass balance program that's already underway, with assistance from Alex Whiting, our local partner with the native village of Kotzebue, as well as one of the members of our advisory council, Bobby Schaefer. We've already started measuring the growth of sea ice in 2 different locations to understand what role the outflow from the Kobuk and Noatak rivers plays in affecting the sea ice in front of Kotzebue. We've also placed a mooring out close to the mouth of Kotzebue Sound to look at how the ice and the currents are behaving there throughout the year. This is a mooring that will stay at the bottom of the ocean for 12 months. We'll recover it again when the ice melts next year and redeploy it for another year. So far, this probably sounds like a fairly common scientific project that a geophysicist like myself would get involved with. But it is different than any other project I've had the privilege to be involved with. And the difference really comes from the level of community engagement that we've been able to achieve already. We were actually extremely fortunate that the Moore Foundation gave us funding before we'd come up with any hypotheses. And so one of the first steps that we've been doing this year is to engage with the community to try and come up with what our research questions should be. We've got tools that we think can allow us to make a wide variety of observations, look at all sorts of different aspects of the environment, including the ocean, the marine life, and the sea ice. But what questions should we be asking with these tools? And in order to come up with those questions, we've approached the community and, as I said, established this advisory council of Indigenous experts. So there's different components to our project, community engagement being one of the most important, of course. We're going to have a sustained period of scientific observations in April and May this year, and then again at the same time next year. We've also got these year-round in situ observations I mentioned. But this year, the focus has been coming up with, also when I say this year, sorry, I mean the past 12 months, our efforts have been spent coming up with what our research question should be. The next movie that's going to play really shows what we've been up to, and I'm going to let the movie play here. I mentioned we have a documentary filmmaker working on our project. Is it playing? Yes. And this was a decision both as a way for us to document what we've been doing, but also I think be able to tell our story, provide our results, share our findings in a way that's actually more compatible with the way that Indigenous knowledge is shared between knowledge holders. As you can see, this is one of our first meetings with the community, and in the background there was a blank whiteboard. We literally started with a blank slate as we started to come up with research questions and fill that whiteboard with ideas and questions that derived from the Indigenous experts in the community. And this is, it doesn't necessarily look all that glamorous, but I think this is what knowledge co-production can look like. It's extremely enjoyable, but it doesn't necessarily have to involve all of those fancy scientific toys that I showed earlier in the presentation. This is incredibly, I think it's just as cutting edge, coming up with hypotheses and research questions that have Indigenous knowledge baked in, because those questions came from our advisory committee members themselves. As you can see, the exchange of knowledge was both ways. As they learned about our technologies and our scientific capabilities, they had questions of their own. They wanted to know what we'd found in this region, how that compared with other regions that we'd studied in the past. And through this two-way exchange of knowledge, we've been able to come up with six different research questions that are important to the local community, but at the same time touch on large-scale scientific questions that are currently challenging the scientific community as we try to understand the larger scale changes that are taking place in the Arctic and the impacts that they're going to have. As you can see, this is part of the two-way knowledge exchange. We also sort of showed off our knowledge and our capabilities. We had an open house where we had the community come. And importantly, we made time for story time there. That last scene was from an afternoon we spent exchanging stories and learning about how stories are used to pass on knowledge. And so this is the first sneak peek of what we hope will be a feature-length documentary that we made about our project when we've finished after 2 more years of data collection. So the 6 research questions we came up with, you can see the whiteboard at the end of two days of, I say it was hard work. We all felt quite exhausted at the end of it, but really we sat around drinking coffee and discussing, but it really was quite intense debate and exploration of the topics at hand. And we came up with these 6 research questions that span the different roles played by sea ice and how that relates to marine mammal distribution in the area, and how the combination of marine mammal presence and sea ice conditions affects hunting success or opportunities. The spread of contaminants and invasive species was also a hot topic among the community members, and so we have research questions that address advection and transport of materials in the Kotzebue Sound region, and how changing sea ice conditions may be favoring new kinds of species that haven't been found before. I'm happy to go into each of these quick research questions in more detail later on, But for now, I'll just quickly look at the first two research questions to explain how these affect both. Sorry, I just had another incoming phone call there that I had to take care of. How they address both local research questions and those that are important to the scientific community at large. So question 0, this is the question that we first identified as a common theme that was being brought up by all the members of our advisory council. What species of marine mammals and birds occupy the lead system west of Kotzebue Sound prior to the breakup of sea ice within the sound? Part of the reason I think this question came up is because this is a time of year and location where the local elders don't get the chance to travel by the snow machine or boat because the conditions are too remote and too hazardous. So if they had a drone, this is what they would go look for. At the same time, the lead system is, we know it's important for marine mammals. We know that it's currently undergoing changes, and being able to get excellent high quality data at that time of year will allow us to answer the local research question whilst also addressing questions that are important to understand changes across the Arctic. The next question, question 1, what environmental factors control marine mammal use of Kotzebue Sound? This really stems from at what point do the bearded seals, that are the primary subsistence species of marine mammal for the folks in Kotzebue, what allows those species, to, those individuals to enter the sound as the sea ice starts to break up? In order to answer this question, we have to understand how do bearded seal use sea ice, what are the sea ice requirements that they have, and what are the dynamical and thermodynamical processes that lead to the breakup of the sound, the creation of open water that the bearded seals can exploit to enter the sound. So there's some fundamental questions here that we need to answer that will be applicable elsewhere in the Arctic, while at the same time this is a very much locally driven question of importance, the importance of which has been identified by our advisory council. And so as a result of this, I think we've ended up with a series of questions that are deep reaching, relevant to the local community, and most importantly, not a series of questions, not questions that we would have come up with ourselves if you just put us as a group of scientists in the room. And it struck me as I was putting this presentation together at the end of our first year, our advisory council, they're not just a source of knowledge, they are holders of a deep well of Indigenous knowledge that holds the answers to many of the questions that we already have, but they're also enablers of new knowledge. They allow us to look for linkages that we didn't know were there to begin with, and they bring out questions among an experienced research team that we would not have been able to come up with had our advisory council members not been in the room. And to summarize this, I'm just going to let Ross Schaefer speak for himself. Ross is one of the members of our advisory council, and this was him speaking during an interview for the Northern Alaska Sea Ice Jukebox program in 2016.
One of the interesting things that I observed when I was on the Beluga Whale Committee was that we did some interviews with people from Elam, Koyuk, and Shaktoolik. And in the interview, the interviewer was confused. The people there were talking about belugas, and all of a sudden they're talking about beavers. And he said, wait a minute, you guys are talking about beavers. What do they got to do with the belugas? He says, the Eskimos told him that what's happening with the beavers, once they get populated, they dam all the lakes. So the whitefish have to move someplace else. And so they displace that food source. So the belugas move somewhere else. That was their connection. And now when you look at Kotzebue and Buckland Bay, the deering, all our areas are contaminated. There's no safe water because the beavers are everywhere.
So, I mean, to stop and reflect on that for a moment, Ross just was able to, in one breath, go from beavers to belugas and understand the connections between those two systems. I think if you had a beaver biologist and a beluga biologist and put them in a room together, it would take them a long time to come up with those connections. So I think this, to me, has become a prime example of the value that Indigenous partnerships can bring to a research team. And so just to summarize, here are 3 lessons I think I've learned from this project for effective co-production of knowledge and integration of Indigenous knowledge into the very earliest stages of research question design. First of all, community engagement is extremely important, and engage early and engage often. Indigenous knowledge holders, they're not just holders of knowledge and can share that knowledge with you, but they can also enable new knowledge through the co-design of hypotheses and allow you to ask questions you'd never have thought to ask without their help. And the co-produced knowledge that we create must, of course, be shared. And so I just remind myself that story time is always important, and it's something you should make time for. And with that, I'm happy to take any questions, and I think the discussion will now be open. I'll let Carolina take over.
Okay, thank you, Andy. Yeah, I completely agree with you. This is what co-production of knowledge looks like. For all of the work that we're involved in, for all of the co-production of knowledge, Indigenous-driven projects we work on, that is what it looks like, is everybody sitting at the table, all of the experts equitably sitting at the table. So thank you to all of our presenters. And to quickly recap, we want to just stress that a co-production of knowledge is a process that includes an equitable partnership and inclusion of both Indigenous knowledge holders and scientists from the inception through analysis and output. These are really important things to remember, and to remember that Indigenous knowledge has its own methodologies, and that it's required for Indigenous knowledge holders to be empowered to bring their own validation to that table, for us to move away from thinking that science has the capacity or should be validating the Indigenous knowledge. These, again, are all the pieces needed to build that partnership. So with those thoughts in mind and these great presentations, we'd like to open it up for discussion. So just a couple of key points in thinking about this discussion. Consider turning your webcam on so we can all see each other. Also, if you go up to the upper right-hand corner of your screen, you can see 2 little boxes. If you push on one of them, you can make it a gallery view so that you can see the presenters and the other people that are talking. Also, you can enter your questions into the chat if you would like to as well. So with that, would anybody like any questions or discussion points that you would like to start?
Carolina, I see one question from Bob Rich in the chat.
Thank you. So Bob wants to know how researchers on the panel take into account respectful knowledge sovereignty of their partners in publications and sharing results. I could just tell you very quickly for ICC, Indigenous knowledge holders are the authors of our work. So for example, if you look at the food security report, it's the Indigenous knowledge holders information, and so they're all the authors of the report. Does any of the other presenters have feedback on that?
Sure, this is Nicole. I'll speak to that a little bit. In terms of the Yukon-Kuskokwim Delta Berry Outlook project, we worked closely with folks in the tribal councils to create the project, and you'll notice that they are listed as authors on this presentation as well. So we're really working with key players and collaborators in each community that are helping us to come up with the questions and write up the results and verify the results. Not every single survey participant obviously would be listed as an author on a publication, but we do have a back and forth with communities where we're presenting preliminary results and then getting feedback before there's final results presented, and ensuring that have this back and forth communication, and that the folks in the communities that really help organize the work that we do there are getting credit for that work.
I think that the other point too for our work is that the Indigenous knowledge holders are the owners of the information. So they maintain physical ownership of it, and we write up contracts to make sure that that stays in place long after those of us currently working with it are moving on somewhere else. Did the other panelists or anybody on the phone have any thoughts or comments about that also?
I'll just add for our Ikagvik Sukukun project, we've all agreed that every member of the team essentially will be a co-author on any paper that's published. From our discussions so far, I think the interest among the advisory council members is, I'm not sure that they actually want to read and review the papers that we publish, but they are very keen to see the content of any documentaries and videos that we produce, and have sort of greatest input from that perspective.
Thank you. Olivia Lee also has a question. She's asking about building capacity and involvement and engagement of Indigenous youth throughout these processes. And so in being reflective in thinking that within academia, we use grad students to build capacity, what are the opportunities for doing that with Indigenous youth? I can tell you that our ways of doing that are directed by the community. So the communities we work with, the tribal councils we work with, or the hunter and trappers committees that we work with, they determine if there is a youth that may be interested to be engaged, to be involved in doing the interviews, to be involved in story time, to be involved in any of the activities. Also, they may be involved in doing analysis and gathering the information at just any point. Does anybody else have any comments about that? Andy, I'm curious, are you guys engaging youth in any way?
We're trying. One of the sets of observations that we've already started is a sea ice mass balance program. It's actually being led by my grad student, Kate Turner, who I believe is on this webinar as well. And we see this as a great opportunity to bring in the younger members of the community, providing them some training in some simple scientific methods, and allow them to produce data that will directly contribute to our results and findings and conclusions. As you say, it's all about finding the right person. At this point, we've not been able to find that right person. We've spoken with, we've given presentations in the local schools, we've put announcements on radio, but at the moment, we've not identified that individual or group of individuals who would help do that.
Mm-hmm. Rochelle, did you have something?
Sure. Thanks, Carolina. I think that that's a great point that Olivia made, and I think an important point that that all of us need to be cognizant of in our work. And it's always something that usually just looking at organizing and working with communities building workshops. It takes funding and it takes dedication towards that funding, and so it's always something that in the pre-proposal that I think would be a good idea to include and consider, especially if in the long term we want to help build capacity with more Indigenous youth that can have and share both world perspectives. So actually, thanks for bringing up that point.
Yeah.
Sorry, so just to follow on from that and add to my last comment, this would actually be a paid position to take these sea ice observations. So we certainly don't expect any participant to do it without pay. Just as was mentioned in Rochelle's talk, the PIs, the grad students on these projects, they're getting compensated for their time. We expect the same in the community. So we have funds available to support community observers. So if there are any people in Kotzebue listening in, we may have a job for you.
That's great. And I just want to share with you guys that Cheryl wrote on here that they have an MOU with First Nation partners that lays out a process, and First Nations get the opportunity to review any materials about the projects, including social media, etc., as well as publications. I know that that's for us also, that the authors review everything before it actually goes out. But I think this is very interesting. What Cheryl is raising is they work out and develop a agreement with each other before starting the project. Cheryl, did you want to share anything else with us about that?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, no, I think it's just part of it's in part because what's happening in Canada right now, the fairly significant efforts that are going into reconciliation, particularly with our Indigenous peoples, applies to research. And in many places, as you well know, research has often been at the head of some of the issues around First Nations rights and jurisdictions. And so where we are is actually in a historical treaty, which makes things even more complicated. And so one of the first things I've done as sort of lead for some of our work is made it really clear that even though there's a mutual interest in some of the things that we are doing as scientists around lake sturgeon, for example, and the community that wants more information about lake sturgeon, that the MOU serves a bit of a template for not only what the traditional information is coming to the project with, but what the science is providing. And then that sort of translates into everything from the co-production of the questions to the way in which that information is given back to the community. And then ultimately, as an NGO, how we then talk about that project to the bigger world and our funders. And so just taking that time, even though it took nearly 5 months to get this MOU through the process, just having that is a really important sort of trust building and collaborative relationship building right off the bat. And even though we have to go back and amend for various reasons, you do sort of use it as your standard for trying to set the tone and the bar for the way in which you're going to conduct yourself on the land with people, and the way you're going to actually then be part of this process of generating information and sharing it.
Thank you, Cheryl. I really appreciate that a lot about sovereignty goes into what you're talking about, that people have sovereignty over their information, over their knowledge, to even get to say how it's communicated out afterwards is really great. There's another comment here of asking, are there novel challenges that arise in co-production of knowledge? If something more akin to truly more ecological systems suddenly materialize and there is a limited or no familiarity in their Indigenous knowledge and scientific communities within geographic area, maybe analogous with the sudden arrival of invasive species. So I would just say with that, there are many challenges with co-production of knowledge, but there are way more benefits to why we need to do it. As a matter of fact, I think we're at a point that we have to do this in order to understand what is happening within the Arctic. But with that in mind too, things always come up that science doesn't immediately have an answer to, or that Indigenous knowledge might not have an immediate answer to. But that's why you work through and you build the knowledge upon what's already known, I think. Does anybody else have any thoughts about that? No, I'm not sure if the person that wrote the comment, but did you have any more thoughts that you would like to share about the question? Sorry, Rochelle, you had something?
Oh yeah, I was actually gonna see if there was anyone from any of the communities on the phone, because I noticed there are some people on the phone, and I was wondering if anyone, actually wanted to talk about invasive species. I've heard a lot of people talk about them before, and so I'd be really curious to hear if anyone on the phone would like to share any of their stories here with the group.
This is Cheryl. I'm not trying to hog the space, but I do struggle with this concept of invasive species in many parts of where we are in the far north of Ontario, because climate is affecting our systems fairly rapidly, and in many cases species are moving in because the habitats are becoming much more suitable. and I won't speak sort of generally for First Nations impressions, but it's been really mixed. There's been sort of folks that are, you know, don't want those species moving into their traditional territories and their ecologies. Others that I guess just assume that this is the way things will be, and if polar bears move further north, then so be it. Something else will come along into the systems as part of the way things are changing all the time. So it's, from that perspective, it gets rather difficult in this new climate change world to think about what really is invasive. Obviously, if people are picking things up and moving them around and they're taking over, that becomes sort of a different story. But in terms of natural connectivity and sort of intact landscapes where we're working, where there isn't a lot of industrial development and fragmentation that's facilitating invasive species movements, it feels, or it seems like that's in part the cultural and the ecological learning of how these new species are getting there, and they may be sort of the next phase of species that we're looking at, as opposed to hanging on to, you know, the species that we've both culturally as well as socially and ecologically built our research programs around, or our communities around. So it's very difficult.
Thank you. If there are anybody from the communities on the phone or online, I just wonder if you have any thoughts about what we're talking about with the inclusion of Indigenous knowledge and the equitable involvement and capacity building and empowerment that allows for you to have a meaningful partnership. Okay, so I think some other comments that came up on the chat line are to do with, again, Indigenous youth. And Martin Jeffries shares that with respect to capacity and Indigenous youth, co-production of knowledge projects can provide good opportunities for experimental place-based learning to talk to teachers. I think this is a really good point because we are encouraging more and more people to learn a co-production of knowledge approach, and we need to involve youth in that process as we work out how to do that and the best ways to do that. There's also some posts here that provide examples and links to capacity building. I think with that, we want to also say that there's a difference between empowerment and capacity building. That, you know, oftentimes communities do have the capacity, but need to be empowered to use that capacity, such as they have the capacity to make decisions, they have the capacity to identify research questions and problems and things like that, but need to be empowered to allow for that to happen. Or not allow for it to happen, for it to happen, I guess. And there is the capacity part, which is very important. I think, does anybody else have any thoughts or questions on the topic? I do think that this, I'm sorry, I don't know who it is because it just says from OMKM UHH, brings up an interesting point. I mean, the person did use invasive species as an example, but I think that it's also speaking to the larger thing of how are we going to have answers to the things we don't understand that are going on. And I think that's kind of what we're talking about here. You know, when we say that Indigenous knowledge is often asking different questions because it's putting in multiple variables to understand the environment, then when these new things come up that we don't understand in the environment, we need both the scientific and Indigenous knowledge questions, driven questions, to know what it is that we should be looking at. And I take that, for example, to what Andy said, of that there's things that his team hadn't even considered to be asking from a scientific perspective until being in this environment together to co-produce the hypothesis and the questions.
Yeah, so if I can just add to that, I think it was Fritz K brought up the question about novel questions that are new to both Indigenous knowledge and the scientific community. I think our ability to identify what is truly novel is much greater if we combine the scientific community and the Indigenous community together. I think you might find examples from both where one community thinks they've seen something that's new, but actually the other community has seen that somewhere else before. So if you really want to stand the best chance of identifying novel occurrences, the co-production of knowledge is, I think, your best approach to do that.
And this is such a good point, and I think that that's where it comes up of what Rochelle was saying of culturally appropriate methodologies, because a lot of that information might be in stories or in songs or things like that. So for example, somebody said to me yesterday, whoa, did you know that communities are starting to eat different foods, like different animals, as if it was a new thing? But in fact, for thousands of years, that's what communities have been doing as part of their traditional management practices. But that just appeared to be new. But if you didn't know where to look for the information, you might not be familiar with that.
I know, Caroline, I totally agree with what you and Andy have just said. And I know, and I was hoping that there might be someone online that from the communities, that could talk about, some of their experiences, because we hear this all the time, right? Stories about, and see it first about, examples of, species that are new, but there might be a history of that or a story about it in the past. But then there are also new species that communities also take advantage of that, become a part of, a way of life. And so, there's also changes going on there, and how past adaptations have occurred can help inform, how some of these changes might occur now and today. And so that might be very helpful in, in explaining and adapting to changes. So the very definition of an invasive species might be something, that might be a part of some of those conversations with communities.
Yeah, it's a very, very good point. So we have a question here. Are there successful frameworks to collect and organize data from different knowledge disciplines and also across communities? Yes. Well, we, for example, the Food Security Project does that, although it's all driven by Indigenous peoples, is their project. We saw today some examples. We also have, Rochelle and I and my colleague have a document that we can share through IARPIC that provides a link to a lot of this kind of information, and we can add to that. I'm sure, Jessica, that it would be fine for us to use the IARPIC space to continue this discussion by adding examples. But I think what's really key here is to understand what are successful examples, and that what defines successful has to be defined by both parties. So the Indigenous knowledge holders have to feel it's been successful also. And that really comes down to asking, well, is that project really empowering the Indigenous knowledge holders to validate their own information, to be involved from the beginning through to the end? Is sovereignty being taken into account? Is equity there? These are all points that I think to us is what we look at and say, yes, that absolutely is a successful co-production of knowledge process, which starts with that long-term relationship. And if we didn't have to go, I guess from there, we could start a whole nother discussion about funding, because as Andy said, he was very fortunate that their funder saw the need for them to build that relationship and build those questions before going out into the project. So that would be a whole nother part to it, I guess. I do have to close up the conversation, but before I go, I'll just ask the panelists if they have any closing thoughts. And I'll pick on you if one of you doesn't talk first. Okay, Rochelle.
I just want to thank the organizers for having this space available for us to talk about this topic. I know that it's something that a lot of people are interested in. I've heard, a lot of interest from a diversity across, governance researchers. And I think it's really important that some of these concepts, overlap. And, I hope that, more people continue to join the conversation and, share their experiences. And I look forward to seeing where this conversation goes.
Thank you. Nicole.
There we go. Yeah, I just want to, again, as Rochelle said, to thank the organizers of this. I think it's really great to have this conversation about how to apply the co-production of knowledge framework in a way that is really respectful of the Indigenous groups that we are working with. So thank you.
Andy.
Yeah, I don't really have a whole lot more to add to that, other than I think forums like this are a really great way to educate people about what co-production is and what it isn't, what best practices might be. And I've still learning a lot from discussions like this about the best ways to approach this and maybe some of the things to avoid with co-production, some practices that have happened in the past that might not be best to continue. So I think these discussions are very valuable. Thank you.
Thank you. And I just want to agree with the rest of the panelists. I think these discussions are extremely valuable and necessary for us to move forward with this, building this process and encouraging the use of this process. So I thank IARPC for organizing it. And the closing thoughts just come back again to things that we have said many times. For all of us to think about, there is a deep need for us to foster environments that are built on trust and respect with partners. And that means empowering the Indigenous knowledge holders to be at that table and to be listened to equitably. This is a key part for us to actually move towards co-production of knowledge, and to have a long-term successful partnership means building that relationship. So I think that we can all, and myself included, leaving this conversation, can think about, what can I do to help move that forward? What can I do within my next project, within my next relationship building activities? What can I do to help that move forward? So with that, again, we'll work with Jessica to post some things on the IARPC webpage. And thank you all for joining us. Guyana.
Thank you to the presenters as well. You were great.
Thank you.